Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning and welcome to this episode of A View from Afar. And right at the top end of this program, we want to dedicate this episode to Y Bird, who passed away sadly this week, and her tangi is at Murupara today as we speak actually. And she is the wife of Pen Bird, my old school teacher, and also the former president of the Māori Party here in New Zealand. So to Y, we wish her a safe and wonderful journey. And Pem, our thoughts are with you and your whānau right now. So with that said, and a dedicated program ahead of us, A View from Afar in this episode, for the third episode of 2023, political scientist Dr. Paul Buchanan and I will analyse this question. What does the geopolitical balancing that is taking place in the West and South Pacific mean for the region and the globe? And Paul and I will consider this question from several angles and provide a context to the headlines that suggest both global powers, the United States and the People's Republic of China, are on a collision course toward conflict. Paul, though, will take us through the US, Papua New Guinea and the Japan-New Zealand bilateral security military arrangements as a balancing response, perhaps as Paul is going to pitch, to the People's Republic of China Solomon Security Agreement that happened a little over a year ago. In addition, Paul will consider the question, does the PRC have legitimate interests in the Pacific? And as a global power, should those interests be understood and respected? And Paul also has written a deep thinking piece on Geopolitical, and we will make reference to that, and Paul will make reference to that, and there will be links both in the YouTube version of this video once it is recorded, and also on Geopolitical back to this for people to have reference this way as well. Also, I will consider about a third of the way through the program whether China's ascendancy as a global power threatens the United States' position as the preeminent defender of the global order. And I'll also raise for debate highlighting what the two global powers' messaging was at the Shangri-La security dialogue that took place over the last weekend. Paul will dovetail off this, and he will come back and deep dive analyse what all this means for the Asia-Pacific region and the world. Okay, with all that said, that's the introduction. Before we cross to Paul, here's an invitation to our live audiences, and thank you for already in attendance. I can see your numbers are there. Feel free to interact with us while we are live via YouTube in particular. You can on Facebook, but sometimes we don't get the questions or the comments through properly. But YouTube is definitely the best for this kind of thing. And remember, if you do make comments or lodge questions, your interaction may be included in this broadcast. Okay, so let's cross to Paul and dig down deep into these issues. Kia ora, tēnā koe, Paul. Iho.
Tēnā koe, Selwyn, and to our listeners as well. Welcome back, and good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, Paul. And our audio kicked in perfectly, so there you go. It's working very fine. Paul, so if you can take us through the main topics and enter into this, and then we will unpack, shall we say, all the complexity around this and speak to those main questions. What does this mean for security in the region and the world, and also what we're witnessing? The back question to all of this, all the way through, is: are the two global powers here on a journey toward conflict, or are we seeing something else here?
Okay, what motivated my thoughts and what eventuated in that Kiwi Political post is I've been thinking about the fact that we've seen this sort of tit for tat between the United States and its allies in the South Pacific and the People's Republic of China trying to make inroads. And so I thought, what I'm looking at here is not a call and response or action and reaction. It's more of a balancing of power. And of course, we hear about balances of power all the time. Some are relatively equal, others are one-sided. But I thought, no, maybe we should just frame what's going on in terms of a balance of power logic, then flesh out the component parts. And so what I'll do is I'll start with a really brief chronology so our listeners understand what this involves. So, and I'm only going to do recent history because things have accelerated in the last 18 months exponentially. The way it goes is this. In March of 2022, the People's Republic of China signed a bilateral security agreement with the Solomon Islands. Now, many people may think the Solomon Islands are inconsequential, but they sit astride one of the major sea lanes of communication connecting Australia and New Zealand with Asia. They were obviously a very important World War II battlefield for exactly that reason. And the Chinese and the Solomon's government signed this agreement, which includes several things, but which also has not been disclosed in its entirety. And that worries Western analysts, as they're not being transparent about what hasn't been publicly released. And what's publicly released is this. The Chinese have agreed to provide advisors to the Solomon police services, particularly with regards to crowd control in the event of unrest, and coincident with that, protection of Chinese investments in the Solomons. The biggest investor in the Solomons is the People's Republic. It's mostly in forestry and nitrates, and every time there's civil strife, Chinese businesses get targeted. As you well know, Selwyn, this is endemic throughout the Pacific, that the Chinese get scapegoated for various reasons. And so that's the internal security component. The external security component is they've agreed to forward port visits by People's Liberation Army Navy vessels. And the suspicion is the Chinese are going to wind up having a forward base in the Solomons. And obviously, the Western Alliance doesn't like that. Well, in response, we've seen the following happen. Last year, New Zealand and Japan signed a bilateral intelligence sharing agreement that goes beyond what existed before, and which some analysts believe is a prelude to the incorporation of Japan into the Five Eyes Signals and Technical Intelligence Network, making it the sixth partner. And obviously, Japan brings a lot to the table. Right now, they're a first-tier partner of the Five Eyes, but this would make them a full partner. That's a big deal. New Zealand has all the technologies of its bigger partners, but in a much smaller package. So when it comes to training, sharing of technologies and whatnot, it seems a reasonable thing to do. And then New Zealand has just signed, as in the last 3 weeks, a bilateral military agreement with Japan, which, if you think that intelligence sharing is needed for military synergies between different armed forces, that would seem a natural progression. The New Zealanders have said that it's mostly about joint humanitarian operations in the South Pacific, that they don't envision any military kinetic exercises in the near future. And Japan has a good record in the South Pacific of humanitarian assistance. In fact, they were involved in the disaster relief efforts that followed the volcanic explosion in Tonga about 18 months ago. And so that's firmed up. And if you think about it, that axis, that vertical axis between New Zealand and Japan, constitute the southernmost and the northernmost outer reaches of what might be considered a defensive picket fence against Chinese great power projection into the blue Pacific. And I'll get to that in a second. On top of that, we just have had the announcement that the United States and Papua New Guinea have signed a bilateral military agreement in which the United States will be able to station troops and stage exercises in the PNG, Papua New Guinea. We'll do joint training with them and the like. And of course, that appears to be a direct response to the Chinese deal in the Solomons, given the proximity of the two archipelagos. Unprecedented that the US would now have basing rights in the PNG. And of course, that follows itself the bolstering of US and Australian military ties to include the forward stationing of B-52 bombers on a rotational basis outside of Darwin. And of course, the AUKUS agreement on nuclear propelled submarines being based in Australia. The deal basically involves US Virginia class submarines forward basing in HMAS Sterling outside of Perth beginning in 2024, and then eventually the arrival of these new AUKUS class boats in the early 2030s. So you're seeing, you can see how it looks like a tit for tat. And in recent days, it's been announced that the Australians are going to hold a military exercise with Japan and the United States up in Queensland near Townsville. But guess who's been invited to the party? The French, the Tongans, and the Fijians. Now that's important because, first of all, Tonga and Fiji are the only Polynesian states that have militaries. Everybody else has police forces, but they actually have militaries. And of course, the French has a very big presence in the South Pacific. It has a Pacific Fleet that's headquartered in Tahiti, and it has a division-sized army located in New Caledonia. And as much as the land component may involve serving as a gendarme in case the Kanaks have an armed revolt, which is in the history of New Caledonia against French control, they're also an expeditionary force. They're mostly amphibious, so they can fight in the region. That's significant. The French are back, and they're part of what I would call this ring fencing project. The deal here is to circumscribe and curtail the ability of the Chinese to move freely in a military way in the Western and Southwestern Pacific. And now they've got these Pacific Island states on board, and as you well know, that means something in this day and age, especially in light of the AUKUS arrangement. It also is significant because of Fiji. Under former Prime Minister Bainimarama, they abandoned their Western allies, and they, under his look north policy, they began to explore military arrangements with the Russians and the Chinese, including the training of officers. The Russians delivered to them weapons, small arms in particular. They turned their backs on the West. Now, under Prime Minister Rabuka, he apparently has decided to slap down the Bainimarama approach and go back to Fiji's traditional patrons and allies. And this is the first step towards it. So, and the Chinese undoubtedly have to see this and go, oh, the tide is actually shifting against us here. So, what I think we're seeing is a ring fencing project now with several layers, if you will, with each one of these bilaterals being a stake in that corral of Chinese maritime projection in particular. But it's not one-sided. The Chinese are trying to break out, as the term goes, through this ring fencing. They want to be able to project force beyond the East and South China Seas. They want to be able to get out into the blue waters. And it's very clear now that most of their neighbors, as well as the US, Australia, and New Zealand, have decided that's not a good idea. And we'll get into that in due course. And I'll leave you with this final thought. So we have ring fencing versus breakout strategies, all as part of a balancing mechanism. The big balance of power is between the US and China as global great powers. But the big balance is made out of what we call nested games, or smaller balancing on a regional or subject basis, because balance of power are military, diplomatic, and economic. And what's playing out here is both military, primarily, but also economic. There's a lot of developmental aid being thrown about by the People's Republic as well as the United States and its allies. But here's something very important for you and I, Selwyn, being citizens of New Zealand. Last weekend, coming out of the Shangri-La security conferences that are held every year in Singapore, our Minister of Defense, Andrew Little, when asked the direct question if New Zealand was going to have to choose a side between the People's Republic and the United States or the West in what appears to be an emerging conflict, militarily and otherwise, his response was, we've already chosen a side. And that, to me, given that we've tried to straddle the fence, we have tried to remain militarily agnostic, if not neutral, because after all, China is our biggest economic partner, our biggest trading partner. For our Minister of Defense to just turn around and say, we've already chosen a side, which clearly is with the West and against the Chinese, let's just say that the roosters are going to come home to roost. As a result of not only that remark, although the Chinese clearly knew which side we were going to go with, but as a result of all this different balancing.
Yeah, there's a number of questions that have come in, Paul. It's probably a good time in the episode to put these through. Marco,
do we freeze?
You still got me there, Paul?
Yeah, Selwyn, I can hear myself, but I see that we've frozen. So maybe we need to reboot and continue from there on.
Can you hear me okay, Paul? Okay. Can you hear me okay? Okay, what we'll do is we'll just go to try and bring Paul back. He can't hear us, so something has happened there with the audio. I'll just bring Paul in if he can once again reconnect here. We've got Paul, but he can't hear or interact with us. So people who are live at the moment, if you can reconnect, that will be really great. We'll be just bear with us. We'll bring up a bit of a screen until we do, and we'll edit this out. Okay, Paul, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we looked at frozen at some point in that that talk.
You came through fine, Paul. So it would have been the bandwidth speed going back to you probably got a bit thin. So bear with us, people. Sorry about that bit of a technical thing. And like we all know that Paul, he lives in a region of New Zealand that was whacked pretty hard by Cyclone Gabriel, and some of the connections out there are a bit thin at times. So we'll endeavour to do that. Paul, we received all of your pitch then. There wasn't a break coming through to the program. So we don't have to redo any of that part. I'll edit out this part in the final recorded version that goes to YouTube and other websites, and also podcasts. So back to the program, Paul. We've got some questions that came in, and I think this is a good juncture to put those questions to you, just to see where we go with those. Anyway, Marco De Jong, he writes here, have we seen the text of the US-PNG Defence Pact yet? And how can Chris Hipkins, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, maintain that it is more transparent than the far more limited Solomon Islands China deal? On the back of that, Paul, I'll put what Marco De Jong has put as well. And he says, or that military presence does not necessarily signify militarization without any such assurance. And also, do you think that the Lumbrum naval base will become a forward port for nuclear submarines? There's another question I'll put to you, but those ones first, Paul. See what you think.
Yeah, well, thanks, Marco. Those are very good questions. The State Department has put out a presser on the bilateral with the PNG, and as always, the devils are in the details. Among the things they've said is that they're working out the technical details of the arrangement. So, although I think in principle, the U.S. and the PNG believe that they will be or promise to be more transparent, it remains to be seen. I think in some sense, it behooves them to be transparent in order to force the Solomons and the Chinese, force their hand to reveal the full details of their agreement. But, absolutely right. Until we see the full text signed off by the Secretary of Defense as well as the Defense Minister of the PNG, we don't know exactly. But I will say this, because of the uniqueness of the South Pacific, and I say that because we're a nuclear-free zone, and I'll get to the Lumbrum base in a second, but also climatically, most of these military arrangements speak in the language of disaster mitigation, humanitarian assistance. I mean, they're really being cautious about talking what may be their real purpose, which is military operations, particularly down here, anti-submarine warfare, and that sort of thing. But the language being used is humanitarian, at least in principle. And so it remains to be seen if that continues to be the main rationale for these agreements. Because, we have to be honest. The military has a lot of non-combat expertise, military engineers, large transportation vessels, all that sort of stuff that can serve humanitarian purposes. And down here, we're prone to national disasters of various sorts. So it could wind up being that the bulk of what these agreements are about, and including the Chinese, are humanitarian exercises of one sort or another. But then again, there are exercises like the one that's about to start in Australia, which are not about humanitarian anything and are about joint combat exercises. In this instance, it's going to involve amphibious assaults and infantry, with the idea of getting the Tongans and Fijians up to speed on the latest tactics and what have you employed by the Australians and their allies. There's nothing humanitarian about that. So whether or not they're honest about their humanitarian intents, the hard fact is that they are a military organization, and at the end of the day, militaries are about dealing death rather than saving lives. Now, with regards to the naval base, interesting question about whether nuclear subs will be based there. I would say, given my realist, cynical orientation, is yes, they will. However, all of that area falls under the jurisdiction of the Treaty of Rarotonga. It is a nuclear-free zone. And so it's quite possible that the base will be used by non-nuclear powered and certainly armed vessels of various sorts. And it remains to be seen once the refurbished base is up and running, if that is the case. But as we said in a previous podcast, the trouble about forward porting those AUKUS subs at HMAS Sterling outside of Perth is that that area was covered by the Treaty of Rarotonga, even if it is on the Indian Ocean. And so, if they're going to violate the treaty by stationing nuclear propelled boats outside of Perth, then the precedent is set for anyone to forward port nuclear propelled vessels. And I think the argument would go, well, we're not putting permanent nuclear structures or fixtures in these areas. We're merely passing through, and the propulsion systems stay on board. That's a bit specious because, quite frankly, HMS Sterling is going to have a nuclear engineering laboratory on shore, for basic repair and refurbishment. So any such base, any base that caters to nuclear propelled vessels, will have to have a similar facility. So I would say, on the balance of probabilities right now, given the risks of nuclear proliferation in the South Pacific if violations of the treaty continue, that we more than likely will not see nuclear propelled or armed vessels there anytime soon. We will see plenty of conventional grade hulls with conventional weapons, but on the nuclear question, I think that cooler heads will say, violating this treaty can open a can of worms. And mind you, it's been interesting because the French have respected the Treaty of Rarotonga. And, the French are not known for not taken kindly to down here, given their histories in the South Pacific with nukes. And yet, even they have agreed that the treaty was a good one. So, on the balance of probabilities, I'd say no, we're not going to see nuclear powered anything anytime soon. But then again, I've been proven wrong many times before.
That's the privilege of speaking out, isn't it, Paul? So there's another question here from Barbara Thomas, and she asks, is there a reason New Zealand has not been invited to these military exercises with Australia, Japan, and the Pacific Islands that you mentioned? And those Pacific Islands are clearly, like you identified there, Paul, were Tonga, Fiji, and you can add that next one in. There's questions around that.
And the French, yeah, and the French.
And the French, of course, yes. So, once again, Barbara's question here is New Zealand, is there a reason New Zealand has not been invited to these military exercises with Australia, Japan, and the Pacific Islands that you mentioned?
Well, it's very interesting, Barbara, because it follows on a snub of Andrew Little, our Minister of Defense, at the Shangri-La meetings, where a host of Pacific Rim ministers of defense got together, and we were not invited, and eyebrows were raised as to why New Zealand stood out because it was not there. Now we have this military exercise. Now I would have to say that the exercise was planned well in advance between the U.S., Australia, and Japanese troops. And again, we'll be headquartered at a big army base, Australian army base, outside of Townsville on the coast, so they can do their amphibious thing. The Tongans and the Fijians, as well as the French, were invited very recently to join this. So I wouldn't say that it started at the Shangri-La meetings because they just ended, but this wasn't long planned. And so the question is, did New Zealand simply say, we don't have time to prepare? Thank you for the invitation, but we will pass on this one. Or they were not invited at all. And there's a third possibility, which is maybe New Zealand will be there, but in a more covert way for reasons.
I think the dynamics in in New Zealand too, maybe just simply pragmatic politically, in the sense that we have a new Prime Minister. Jacinda Ardern has moved off patch. There is an issue relating to the demotion by way of cabinet ranking of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Nanaia Mahuta. And secondly, we are right smack on the edge of almost getting into campaign proper for election year in New Zealand, where the two major parties, the National Party, which has been the leader of the opposition for some years now, and the Labour Party, which has led the government efforts in New Zealand for some years now, since 2017, are very, very close in the polls, and it could go either way depending on what third-party support either party gets, really. So that's where we sit in New Zealand, and that may have some context to actually why New Zealand, in my view, is not engaging so much on the world stage. We've mentioned, and I will speak to the points of the Shangri-La dialogue as well, New Zealand really didn't have a significant presence there at all in any way, and yet we're a member of the ASEAN nations, which featured very strongly, and of which Timor-Leste, for example, with Jose Ramos Horta speaking with quite authority at the dialogue on his view of where the superpower clash is occurring and what absolutely needs to happen from an ASEAN and regional point of view. So there was a lot happening there. Paul, there's just another one I'd just like to bring up from Marco De Jong, because it's right on space of what you're talking about. It's deep into the militarization issue that we're looking at today as well, in tandem with the dialogue. So I'll bring that up and I'll read it for the listening audience as well. Now, Marco De Jong, he writes, the text of the Treaty of Rarotonga mentions deployment. Do you subscribe to the idea that the B-52s and perhaps the subs violate this, given deterrence implies permanent and combat-ready force? So, Paul, back to you with that. It's digging down deep and specifically.
Yeah, I would say in short, no, it doesn't. And the reason for that is that the B-52s will carry conventional cruise missiles. We've talked about this in the past in previous episodes. The advent of modern targeting technologies and the miniaturization of weaponry in general has removed the need to have these devastating nuclear weapons with their overkill capability. I mean, precision strikes are a reality these days. So the B-52s are non-nuclear armed. Again, they have these advanced cruise missiles that can deliver, 1,000-pound warheads within, 3 or 4 feet of, a window, an open window that serves as the targeting point. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. I think the bigger concern is that if you're going to bring subs into the region, you're going to need shore facilities. Even the extraction and insertion of fissile material in submarine reactors can become a thorny problem. And so I think that the focus should be there is, are we opening the door to if you will, a slow incremental proliferation that doesn't involve weapons? Now, Selwyn, just if I may, piggybacking on what you said, two things. One focused on New Zealand, and then one a little broader. You're absolutely right, and I think that our foreign listeners need to understand we're in an election year here, and the Hipkins government that replaced the Ardern government. I mean, he had a lot to follow up to, because Jacinda Ardern, I mean, she's just been named a dame, popular world figure. He has shifted to the right. And it's very clear, Selwyn mentioned the de facto demotion of the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she had that whole let's bring a Maori perspective into our foreign relationships. He's moving away from that. And Andrew Little, his defense minister, who was appointed defense minister by Hipkins, the previous guy who was Maori, he got the boot and demoted. Little is on the right wing of the Labor Party, and that bluntness about we've chosen a side, he couldn't have done that without a nod from Chris Hipkins, but everything has to be viewed through the lens of an election in which the right center party is going to the right. See, their tail is something called the ACT Party, a sort of populist
libertarian, odd mixture, they're wagging the right center party's tail. So these guys now are doing racist dog whistling, are acting tough when it comes to crime and those sort of things. Well, on a military level, they're headed to the right. They would like to join AUKUS. They would like to get rid of the non-nuclear policy. I say that sort of speciously. And so what Labor's doing is just cutting them off from getting any traction in the military security field and going, you know what, we're not going there, but we're not going to do things active that could hinder our chances of forming a coalition in the next election, which happens in mid-October. They would like to have the Greens on their side. They would like to have the Maori Party on their side. And so I think it is a fine balancing act. I just think that, we may wind up having a presence at these exercises in mid-June, but it's simply not announced, without fanfare. It could be a special forces unit, because they're essentially the special forces guys start out as infantrymen. It could be something along that, or we're not participating at all. But the reason I'm saying we might be around there is because New Zealand has a history of training Tongan and Fijian troops because of our cultural affinities and the like. And so, I think, well, we might be there as advisors and not actually, you're running around in the sand and what have you. Now, the bigger point is...
But just on this, Barbara has raised a point here before we move on to that. And she says, I cannot accept that we have not been, meaning New Zealand has not been invited because of our elections. National security overrides local elections. She does not accept the right-wing leaning of HIPCAS either. Sorry, Paul. Just speaking to the first point on that, I think what we're seeing here and what Paul's response is, and it's certainly one I'd agree with, that politically New Zealand is not putting the flag up and showing that its presence is there. And I think all the reasons that we've outlined give a good indication of why. And behind that, it doesn't stop, for example, the departments or the ministries or, the more, the active wings of security within New Zealand's government apparatus from engaging in whatever way they so should wish to, and that's what Paul's detailing there. More the active on the ground elements of New Zealand government as opposed to the executive government wing. So that's how I see the situation at the moment, Barbara, and that might in some way explain. I think too, your second part there, speaking from a New Zealand political observer of some years, I think the left-right kind of identification of where someone sits on an economic axis can quite often blur the realities of other axes that are in play too. So I think with Chris Hipkins as our Prime Minister, we have seen on the economic axis and also on the humanitarian axis some change, but particularly on the moving into areas of centre-right that perhaps National wouldn't traditionally occupy, and that may have some indication as to why might be found, I should say, within the poll positions of both major parties being so close at the moment. So it's like the centre-right ground is one that Labor is wanting to stretch across. Perhaps if we looked at one being extreme hard left, 10 being extreme hard right on the economic axis, Labor seems to be quite willing to pitch around 7 on that scale. So that's where I would leave that. Paul, you're just back to the other main point that you wanted to raise.
Yeah, and I accept Barbara's critique. That's why we have horse races, right? Differences of opinion. But I will say I defer to Selwyn when it comes to domestic politics. This is a guy who's been 30 some odd years involved in New Zealand domestic politics. So I'll cede the floor to him when it comes to that analysis. Now, the bigger point is it was mentioned in the talking points at the beginning of the show. Does China have a legitimate right to pursue its interests in the South Pacific? It's an emerging great power. No one can deny that fact. Great powers do what they have to do, which is project influence into open space, including the blue waters of the Pacific. So, does the PRC have legitimate interests in the South Pacific? And my answer is absolutely yes. If former empires and current great states can pursue their interests around the world, often in rather nefarious fashion, then there is no reason why the Chinese cannot do so as well. And if you think about the Belt and Road Initiative, if you think about the amount of infrastructure development and other economic assistance the Chinese have an investment that have put into places like sub-Saharan Africa, as well as the larger Pacific Basin, because they're the major investors in Chile, they're major investors in Argentina, Peru. The Chinese have really put themselves out there, and think about that. Everybody says, yeah, they're starting to control everything. Well, there are great risks in doing so. They could lose these projects if there's a revolution. I mean, there's a lot of risk attached to Chinese power projection. So I don't question the legitimacy of them trying to achieve great power status by doing what every great power does, which is moving out there. They would have an interest in protecting the sea lanes of communication, as well as potential natural resource exploitation fields. All of this has been done before by great powers. So what's the problem with the Chinese? And I sit here often going, what exactly is the problem with the Chinese? Well, let me dispense with one of them. My human rights friends will say, well, the problem with the Chinese is they're run by an authoritarian regime that systematically abuses the rights of their own people and then engages in genocide, at least culturally, of minority communities like the Uyghurs. And I think to myself, yeah, I don't like that. I'm a liberal Democrat socialist at heart. But when has that ever stopped anyone from dealing with a great power? I mean, think about us in New Zealand. We talk about a principled foreign policy. That's rubbish. We trade with authoritarians all the time. We trade with the Saudis, with the UAE, the Kuwaitis, the Iranians. The Chinese are our biggest trading partner. That's because foreign affairs is, in most instances, value neutral. I hate to say it because I have a wee bit of idealism in me, but the realist says, don't project your values about internal organization, representation, transparency, and the like, which are white Anglo-Saxon liberal values that you're trying to transpose onto other cultures that have no histories of democracy and the like. Don't do it. Just trade, and if need be, enter into security agreements where feasible. So I'm dispensing with that. What I will say is it's not about the legitimacy of Chinese interests that worries the Western-led alliance, because let's remember, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Japan, they're not Western countries, and they're quite anti-Chinese. It reminds me of the old jokes about the Poles being asked about how they feel about the Russians, and the answer was, we think of the Russians as brothers. And when the commentator said, what do you mean, brothers? And he goes, well, we can choose our friends. The neighbors of the Chinese know the Chinese really well, and they don't like them. They have reasons for that. I won't get into it, but I will say this. It is Chinese behavior that has people worried, West and non-West. It is the Chinese pattern of, they call it assertive military diplomacy. Most of their neighbors will call it bullying, the island building project, the repeated encroachment of their neighbors' territorial waters, very aggressive military posturing in a variety of places. You could say, well, the United States does the same. Therein lies the rub. When China was brought in to the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, what was it now, 10, 15 years ago, the idea was that they would accept the rules-based international liberal order. They would understand that they will mutually benefit, in a rising tide raises all boats sort of way. They would achieve greatness, but they had to play by the rules. Now, we know the rules were made for and by the Western former colonial powers. Totally understood.
I'll speak to these points in a
Okay,
moment.
I'll let you go with that. The issue is that the Chinese accepted entrance into these liberal institutions and then have systematically violated the rules and norms that underpin them. So the idea is it's not about their internal behavior, it's about their external behavior. The West, quite frankly, I don't think the United States government particularly concerns itself about Uyghurs. I'd hate to say it, but I don't think the French do. It's all about the international arena and how the Chinese conducts themselves. And I think that's the crux of the problem. It's just Chinese behavior is considered to be anathema to the international status quo. And of course, the Chinese have responded in concert with the Russians by saying, yeah, but that's a post colonial order that you guys erected to keep your dominance. And we reject that. We want a new global South based international order. And that's what you're really upset about. And I'll tell you what, I can't really argue strongly against that. I think that the truth lies somewhere in between. But the issue is Chinese foreign behavior, particularly its military, quote unquote, diplomacy, and its near abroad. And that's the crux of this ring fencing project. And until their behavior changes, we're going to see more of it, because the ring fencing is ultimately about raising the cost to the Chinese of their power projection. If you have to, stumble across other military vessels watching your every move, you're burning a lot of resources and expending a lot of capital just to get out into open water. That's exactly what this is all about.
Yeah, a lot of what I was going to contribute, I'll relay on to another episode, because we simply will not have time to dig down deep into those areas, Paul. But just in response to some of those claims, I would position my viewpoint here and my response from a more independent position. So not necessarily responding as if I was putting myself into the shoes of the People's Republic of China nor the United States, but one perhaps of observing it from a smaller state that embraces multilateralism within the ASEAN trading bloc. And my response to those points would be, yeah, sure, China on all of those points that you raised is fitting and gets a tick. That's absolutely correct and factual. I'd also point out that the United States under the Trump administration tried to undermine the WTO, the World Trade Organization, the WHO, the Health Organization, even NATO. Tried to undermine and unpack that to the point of irrelevancies. But let's get back to the WTO, because that's a primary point here. Trump did not seek recourse through the WTO to any grievance that they may have believed was occurring at the hands of the People's Republic of China that countered the United States' trade and economic interests. He actually went to what the people in the region here, the ASEAN bloc nations, saw and perceived as some sort of trade war against China. So he broke out of the legal frameworks of the global order and went for them on a bilateral basis and tried to actually create supremacy. So from an independent point of view, I think that the United States has ample amounts of hypocrisy of which others can observe and perhaps use in the same way, and it's in a position of evaluation and analysis of the United States' behaviours in most recent times. Now, we know the administration has changed, but we once again in other programs we've highlighted the fact that within the United States the political movements of which brought Trump to office exist, and whether or not Trump is there to herald those changes, the threat to the United States' stability with respect to global and also domestic politics still exists in my view. If you look at this whole thing and stand back from it, one of the points that we might bring to another program that may be worthwhile is around the question of, does China's ascendancy as a global power threaten the United States' position as the preemptive defender of the global order? And as the United States committed to the global order on all of these pillars of international law, respect of the International Criminal Court. It would be nice to see the United States once again reattach itself to that and have some sort of legitimacy over such things that the world needs at this time, but also particularly in trade. The other thing within the region I'd just add at this juncture is, while we're talking trade, one of the things that came through very strongly from, I mentioned earlier, from Jose Ramos Horta, who was instrumental in bringing independence and East Timor toward a legitimate, peaceful nation, of which has prospered arguably very much under that change in 1999 onwards toward democracy, and certainly enjoying democracy as it is now. He is saying in his view at the Shangri-La dialogue, that dialogue is the way forward here, and his concerns with the two global powers on these bigger issues of consideration, and like is raised here, is China's ascendancy a threat to the United States' position as preemptive defender of such norms and international norms. So, Paul, those are big issues that perhaps we can park and unpack it in a later time. But within the context of all of this, I'll just raise a couple of the security comments and leave that for the audience to pick through, and also for you to analyse and conclude the program, Paul. At the Shangri-La dialogue, for example, I'll start with what the Chinese said in one of the noted preliminaries there. General Li Shangfu, the State Councillor or Minister of National Defence, China, and I'll just read, and please, audience, don't see that I'm necessarily subscribing to this, nor the comments from the United States. I'm just merely giving a position of what was spoken, and the links will be in the program. General Shangfu, he said, and I quote here, "We in China believe the key for countries to live in harmony is mutual respect and treating each other as equals." He added, "Some countries have willfully interfered in other countries' internal affairs and matters in the affairs of other countries, and frequently resorted to unilateral sanctions, incursions with force. It has incited colour revolutions and proxy wars in different regions, created chaos and turbulence, and just walked away, leaving a mess behind. We must never allow such things to happen again in the Asia Pacific." Now, clearly what he's talking about is the United States, and probably citing things like in the Middle East and the policies there with respect to Afghanistan, and also in Iraq. And Paul and I have dug into such things very deeply too. He added there, the world is big enough for countries, including China and the United States, to grow together. The right way for China and the United States to get along is following the three principles of mutual respect, peaceful coexistence, and a win-win cooperation. Now, there's the messages that China was putting to the Shangri-La Security Dialogue, and its audience there clearly is not necessarily domestic, but perhaps a touch of that, but certainly the other ASEAN nations that are there, that are joined and have joined the United States' ring-fencing security interests in the region. The United States Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Justin III, he says here, and I will direct quote once again, Paul, I'll just encourage you and the audiences to come back from that. And he says, and that's more on keeping with where we've been in this program, he says, "We are making bold investments in air power, including the additional $61 billion for our F-35s and the F-22s and uncrewed aircraft, and not to mention the B-21 Raider. We are investing in an expanded fleet of subs, carriers and destroyers, as well as in space and cyberspace, and long-range fires, including hypersonics. And at every point, we are committed to sharing the advances that we have made to help our partners." And then he adds here, with respect to the People's Republic of China, and the Secretary of State, the US Secretary of State says, "The People's Republic of China continues to conduct an alarming number of rescue intercepts," which has been happening, including throughout this week, I'll just add, "of the US and allied aircraft flying unlawfully in international airspace. We have just seen another troubling case of aggressive and unprofessional flying by the PRC. So we will support our allies and partners as they defend themselves against coercion and bullying. To be clear, we did not seek conflict or confrontation, but we will not flinch in the face of bullying and coercion. Now, all of this is especially important in the Taiwan Straits." Paul, I think what the United States is doing here is it's saying, We have come back stronger since the Trump years. We are determined to force the United States' interest within the region and to make sure it endures. We are prepared to do that by security means. And I think the United States is also saying Taiwan is a no-go area. Do not go there. That's the tripwire. That's the area where conflict can spark. But we are firm in our resolve. Don't underestimate our positions now. And it's almost like they're signaling the United States in this area is no longer weak. Please do not perceive it as such. In counter to that, the Chinese are saying, hey, let's talk. Now, the United States wants the PRC to talk militarily, to have those connections back again, those areas of safety, perhaps in dialogue within military to military. The PRC is saying, no, we do not want that. It's almost like it's saying we want to be treated with mutual respect as the words that it's seeding in to its position. But that mutual respect, what does China mean by that? Does it actually expect that mutual respect means to allow China's interests to go unchallenged? So this is where we are at. It seems both sides of the United States also indicated very strongly it wants dialogue, but within the military security space. The Chinese are saying, well, we want dialogue on this mutual respect platform as two global powers side by side. Paul, that's a quick evaluation of digging down into what was coming out of the Shangri-La dialogue. Back to you to make sense of where that is, and we'll conclude the program in about whenever you wish.
Yeah, you've actually summed it up very well. They're talking past each other. Lloyd Austin sounded like a weapons salesman with his inventory of all the stuff that they're building and whatnot. And the Chinese defense minister, who's under U.S. sanctions, spoke as a statesman about the larger global configuration. And that's exactly what's going on. In the Kiwi Political post that I just wrote, towards the end, I talk about self-limiting strategies, and that the liberal internationalist order, the rules-based order, was not just a way to promote a status quo dominated by former colonial powers, but it was a way to diminish and regulate conflict between them so that economic conflicts wouldn't become military conflicts. And I urge readers to go and read the entire piece, but look at the sections on self-limitation, because there's no reason for the United States not to be able to share space with China in a newly configured bipolar world. Again, Russia is a declining power. We've been through that. The question is, will both of these countries in this new bipolar arrangement, should they ever get to it, agree to mutual self-limitation? That is, to not use force to pursue national interests willy-nilly, to agree to areas to disagree, maybe even to agree to areas of influence. But the point was, and here I side with the Chinese, while Austin's talking about armaments, they're talking about the nature of the international system. They're being more realistic. The United States may wax nostalgic for the unipolar moment. White male people in the States wax nostalgic about the 1950s when white men ruled over everybody else. Those days are gone. They're gone.
Thankfully.
Yeah. And I would say, thankfully, it's good that the U.S. is no longer the unipolar, quote unquote, hegemon. The emerging multipolar world is such that the United States will be one amongst a number of emerging great powers, and it has to learn to live with that. Well, the Chinese are much more cognizant of what's coming ahead than reliving the past, and they don't like their past. They felt they've been hemmed in, denied their great power status. So the first thing we got to do is give up the arms salesman approach and become more statesman-like. Now, maybe Lloyd Austin, because he's a defense minister and he wants to sell American, weapons to allies, talk the way he did. We need Anthony Blinken to get back to talking to his counterpart about the emerging international system and what accommodations can be made to bring China back into the fold. And, again, Trump, I hope, was an aberration. You well know that hypocrisy is the currency of diplomacy. But to belabor U.S. hypocrisy endlessly, and it's done, some of our listeners do this all the time. But what about the United States? What about this? Let's look forward. The Chinese can talk about U.S. hypocrisy and their sorry record of interventionism, but we've got to look forward. We've got to find a modus vivendi between China as the newly arrived great power and the U.S., I hate to say it, as the declining great, they're no longer a superpower. Militarily, they may be, but, everything else is starting to deteriorate. And here's the thing. What I got out of the Chinese refusing to talk to Lloyd Austin is something that you brought up a couple of sessions ago when you talked about the U.S. as being viewed as an unstable polity and henceforth unreliable. That was a brilliant thing to say, because I think that's what the Chinese believe. The Chinese thought to themselves, besides the slights of having their defense minister under sanction, they look over at Lloyd Austin and go, why should we talk to this guy? We don't know what's going to happen in 2 years. The country is melting down with these MAGA guys, and there's now 12 people competing to be the Republican nominee, and they're trying to outflank each other on the weirdness dimension. And so I think if I'm the Chinese...
Looks like we've lost Paul suddenly. I'll just bring him back. Bear with us, and if Paul's connection is completely dropped, then we'll wind the program up. Yeah.
Did you find me, or did you lose?
I've got you back now, Paul. So if you just wind up where you were,
I'll
just cut out suddenly. Yep.
Yeah, I think that the Chinese see themselves in a position of advantage where they don't have to necessarily talk to the United States at the level the United States wants to talk to, i.e., defense minister to defense minister. They want to talk about the bigger scheme of things. And until the United States realizes that it's in its best interests to understand the emerging global order for what it is, which means the U.S. doesn't get to dictate the terms anymore, then the possibility for negotiated compromises on a host of issues, including the ICC, and including a host of international institutions, their conformation, their orientation, all that sort of stuff will depend on talks between this emerging bipolar configuration within a larger multipolar world. And I'll finish with this. We must always remember that China is not homogeneous. Its leadership is not monolithic. There are factions, there are differences of opinion. They just organize differently than liberal democracies do. So what Xi Jinping and his faction may want to do today and into the near future may not be entirely welcome by people who are more far-sighted or who think that this approach is too short-sighted and needs to be tempered by something more, medium or long distance when it comes to forecasting. So on that note, I'll simply say, we are in now a balancing moment where all of this ebb and flow between these two powers and then the constellations that surround them are very fluid and are moving to check each other in various ways, shapes, and forms. And to my mind, that's going to occur for the foreseeable future until if you will, macro dialogue is established between these two great powers.
Thank you for that, Paul, and thank you for your contribution and also picking through all the complexity and giving the context to these major issues that are here. I do think that we will look into the primary kind of areas of influence, perhaps, if we put it that way, and start thinking in that respect in future episodes as well, which will make sense as to what we are seeing on defence and security grounds. One of the observations, once again, from the nations, the ASEAN nations, at the Shangri-La dialogue only last weekend, was one of a reality and a pragmatic point of view. And they're basically saying the ASEAN bloc stands firm and is integral, and China is a significant component of the ASEAN trading bloc, and it's all about trade. And so, this is where the self-interest of countries' economic aspirations rely and sit. When we talk about security, we may have more in common as a bloc, as a region, with the United States' interests, arguably. But nobody sees the United States willing nor able to come to the table with trade relationships that help to balance those real necessities of GDP and the quality of life for its peoples, and also the economic and environmental aspirations that all countries are inching toward agreeing to. So those are some of the big issues that, within the global environment in 2023 that perhaps we can embrace in different ways and make sense of in future episodes. There's a number of comments that have come through. I've brought them up on the screen. I thank the people that have been here during the live recording of this, and thanks for hanging in there when we've dropped connections and things like that too. Your comments and also your interaction is highly regarded, and we look forward to more of that in the future. For those that are listening to it on demand, we will be back in 2 weeks' time with another major issue to dig down deep into, and we look forward to your company once again then. And once again, those that are on the platforms or are hearing this, please do subscribe to the podcast so you can pick it up through your favorite ones. They're all there: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the others. And also for those that want to watch and engage, YouTube's the place at the moment. So do that too. Thank you very much for your company, for your time. And once again, we just think of Pen Bird and his passing of his wife, Bird, whose tangi, which is, for those that don't reside in New Zealand, means funeral, has been happening today. Take care, ka kite anō, and we look forward to your company in 2 weeks' time. Goodbye.